man born of the earth, the son of humble peasants in a nation obsessed with lineage rise, to command an army of aristocrats, counts, and career officers who view him as little more than a provincial clod. How does this same man, defined by his cautious, plodding, and deeply unfashionable ideas, become the single most revered hero of his nation's most traumatic war? A living demigod whose very image is synonymous with courage and salvation. And finally, how does this icon, this savior, this victor of Verdun, come to preside over his nation's most profound humiliation, becoming the executioner of the very republic he once saved, his name forever erased from glory and etched into the annals of treason? This is the central, agonizing paradox of Philippe Pétain, a story that is not merely the biography of a man, but the tragic biography of France itself, in the 20th century, a story of unimaginable glory, deep-seated rot, catastrophic failure, and the terrible, complex shadows that lie between heroism and betrayal. Henri Philippe Bénoni Omer Joseph Pétain was born on April 24, 1856, in Cochiat-la-Tour, a small village in the Pas-de-Calais region of northern France. He was not born to privilege, but to the soil. His parents, Omer and Clotilde, were farmers, part of a long line of peasants who had worked the same land for generations. In the rigid social hierarchy of 19th century France, his destiny was seemingly written to live and die in obscurity, just as his ancestors had. But a local priest, seeing a spark of intellect in the boy, encouraged him to pursue an education. "'Tis led him, against all social odds, to seek a career in the one institution that offered a sliver of meritocratic advancement, the army. He entered the École Spéciale Militaire de Saint-Cyr, the nation's premier military academy, in 1876. There, he was an anomaly. The officer corps was the traditional domain of the Catholic aristocracy, of the sons of wealth and influence. Pétain was poor, provincial, and utterly lacking in the social graces or ideological fervor of his peers. He was a slow, methodical, and uncharismatic student, graduating 403rd out of a class of 412. He was, from his very first day in uniform, an outsider. Pétain's career mirrored his academic performance. It was plodding, undistinguished, and almost entirely stagnant. He moved from one garrison town to another, slowly climbing the ranks through seniority rather than brilliance. But in one area, he excelled. As an instructor, he was eventually assigned to teach infantry tactics at the École de Guerre, the French Army's war college. It was here that the quiet outsider became a quiet heretic. The entire French military establishment, still smarting from the humiliating defeat of the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, had embraced a single, quasi-religious military doctrine: the offensive or offensive to the extreme. This philosophy, championed by brilliant and charismatic figures, like his future commander Ferdinand Foch, taught that the French soldiers' innate élan spirit and a ferocious, headlong bayonet charge could overcome any material obstacle, including the newly invented machine gun and rapid-fire artillery. It was a doctrine of moral force over firepower, of romanticism over reality. Pétain, the farmer's son, the pragmatist, looked at this and saw only suicidal madness. His superiors, obsessed with their cult of the offensive, saw his teachings as something far worse: cowardly, defeatist, and profoundly un-French. At the École de Guerre, Pétain taught a doctrine that was simple, radical, and, to the high command, utterly profane. He boiled it down to three small, devastating words: "Le Few Tuesday," or firepower kills. He argued, based on his own careful study of modern weaponry and the recent Russo-Japanese War, that the age of the bayonet charge was over. The machine gun and modern artillery, he insisted, had made the battlefield a zone of death that no amount of human spirit could cross. He taught that victory would not go to the most aggressive, but to the most methodical. He preached the importance of coordinated, massive artillery barrages to destroy enemy defenses before the infantry advanced. He emphasized careful defense, concrete fortifications, and the conservation of his men's lives. This was heresy. It flew directly in the face of the army's romantic obsession with reckless, glorious charges. His superiors were appalled. His insistence on the primacy of firepower and defensive tactics was seen as a sign of a weak character. As a result, his career withered. His promotions stalled, and he was passed over time and again in favor of more aggressive and more politically acceptable officers. By the summer of 1914, Philippe Pétain was years old, a little-known colonel in command of the 33rd Infantry Regiment at Arras. He had never commanded a unit in combat. His career was effectively over. He had purchased a small villa and was just weeks away from his mandatory retirement, destined to be forgotten by the very army he had tried and failed to warn. One of his junior officers in that same regiment, a young and ambitious captain named Charles de Gaulle, was one of the few who had actually listened to and admired the old colonel's pragmatic teachings. Then, in August 1914, the Archduke Ferdinand was assassinated. The alliances clicked into place, and the Great War exploded across Europe. The war didn't just save Pétain's career. It was the sole, terrible event that could have vindicated it. Suddenly, this obscure, retiring colonel was on the front line, finally given the chance to test the theories that had been ridiculed in peacetime. As the French army, burning with the fever of offensive à outrance, marched into the battle of the frontiers, their theories were proven wrong in a baptism of blood. In just the first few weeks of the war, entire divisions were annihilated, as French infantry, in their bright red trousers, and bluecoats charged, with suicidal bravery, directly into the interlocking fire of German machine guns and artillery. The flower of French youth was cut down in a matter of days. The army's guiding philosophy exposed as a catastrophic, romantic delusion. But in one small sector, a single colonel was doing the impossible. Pétain, commanding his regiment, and then, very quickly, a brigade, refused to order his men into pointless charges. He advanced methodically, using his artillery to shatter the enemy line before his infantry moved. He conserved his men's lives. He took his objectives, while other generals were failing and being fired by the dozen. Pétain's defensive, firepower-based ideas were suddenly, glaringly, and bloodily proven correct. His rise was meteoric, the most rapid in the history of the French army. In a matter of months, he was promoted from colonel to brigadier general, then to divisional command, and by the end of 1915, to command of the Second Army. February 9, he would attack a point on the French line that was so important to French national pride that they could not, under any circumstances, retreat. His target was the ancient, fortified city of Verdun. Falkenhayn's objective was not to capture the city. It was, in his own chilling words, to bleed the French army white. He planned to use a massive, overwhelming concentration of heavy artillery to obliterate the French defenses, and then draw the French army into a mincing machine, a battle of pure attrition where he would kill them in such vast numbers that France would be forced to sue for peace. On February 21, 1916, the assault began with the most intense artillery bombardment in human history. 9 hours later, German stormtroopers advanced, finding the French front lines completely pulverized. The French defenses, neglected by a high command that still believed in the offensive, began to collapse. Fort Douaumont, the cornerstone of the entire defensive system, was captured by a small German scouting party without a single shot fired. The road to Verdun was open. The French army was on the verge of total disintegration. In Paris, the government panicked. The French commander-in-chief, Joseph Joffre, who had been preparing his own grand offensive on the Somme, was forced to confront the apocalypse at Verdun. He had one man, and only one man, whose entire career had been built on the very principles of defensive, methodical, artillery-based warfare now required to hold a line. Pétain was given command of the shattered front. He arrived in the middle of a blizzard, in the dead of night, to a headquarters in total chaos, with officers openly weeping and speaking of retreat. He was calm, cold, and methodical. He immediately began issuing orders, reorganizing the artillery into a massive, coordinated system that could answer the German shell for shell. He forbade any more Larska, suicidal, and then he issued the single proclamation that would electrify the nation and define his legend, a simple, grim, tactical order that became a national rallying cry: Ils ne passeront pas. They shall not pass. Pétain understood that Verdun would not be a battle of élan, but a battle of logistics. The Germans controlled the main railway lines, leaving the French with only one tiny, second-rate road into the fortress. Pétain immediately seized on this single artery as the key to the entire battle. He designated it La Voie Sacrée, the sacred way. He shut it down to all other traffic and organized a relentless, 24-hour-a-day, non-stop circular convoy. Thousands of trucks, bumper to bumper, drove with their headlights on, ferrying a constant stream of fresh troops, ammunition, and food into the meat grinder, and carrying the endless river of wounded men out. It was the first truly motorized, large-scale logistical operation in history. This single road, maintained by soldiers who shoveled gravel under the wheels of the moving trucks, became the artery that kept the French army at Verdun alive. Without it, the fortress would have fallen in a week. Pétain, the pragmatist, knew that heroes and bayonets were useless if they had no bullets. While the Sacred Way supplied the battle, Pétain's tactical innovations saved the army itself. He knew that firepower, not men, had to do the killing. He orchestrated what he called a rolling storm of artillery, meeting the German bombardment with an equally terrifying French one, turning the entire landscape into a lunar crater field. But his most crucial innovation was a human one. He recognized that the human mind and body could only endure the apocalyptic hell of Verdun for so long before breaking. He refused to let his divisions be annihilated in place, as the German army was. He instituted the Noria system, named for the North African water wheels that continually bring up water. He began rapidly rotating divisions off the front line, often after just a week or two in the trenches. They would be sent to the rear to rest, refit, and absorb replacements before being sent back. Over the course of the 10-month battle, he rotated nearly 3/4 of the entire French army through the mincing machine. This meant that while the army as a whole suffered horrific casualties, no single unit was completely destroyed. He saved the army from total annihilation, preserved its morale, and in doing so became a national icon, revered by the common soldiers, the poilus, who saw him as the only general who truly cared about their lives. The year 1917 marked the breaking point. After the bloodletting at Verdun and the Somme, the French army was exhausted. The government, desperate for a war-winning victory, replaced the methodical Pétain, whom they promoted to chief of staff, with the charismatic general Robert Nivelle. As commander-in-chief, Nivelle, who had made his name with small-scale counterattacks at Verdun, promised the politicians a lightning breakthrough on the Chemin des Dames. He claimed his new tactics, involving a creeping barrage, would win the war in 48 hours. The offensive, launched in April 1917, was a catastrophic, unmitigated disaster. The Germans had captured his plans and had prepared a massive The French army charged into a perfectly prepared killing field, suffering over 180,000 casualties for absolutely no strategic gain. This was the final straw. The French army, bled white for 3 years, finally broke. They went into open revolt. Across the front, entire divisions refused to obey orders to attack. This was the great French Army Mutiny of 1917. The soldiers didn't desert, and they didn't surrender. They simply announced they would defend their trenches, but they would no longer participate in any more suicidal, pointless offensives. The French government was gripped by terror. The army was collapsing from within, a secret they desperately kept from the Germans. They had one last card to play. They fired the disgraced Nivelle and appointed the only man the soldiers trusted, the only general who had been proven right time and again, the man who had promised to save their lives, Philippe Pétain. He was made commander-in-chief of the entire French army. His task was not to fight the Germans, but to save the army from itself. He handled the crisis with a masterful blend of firmness and compassion. He staged trials and had several dozen of the ringleaders executed to restore military discipline. But he simultaneously addressed the soldiers' real grievance. He personally visited over 90 divisions, driving into the trenches, speaking to the men face to face, eating their food, and listening to their complaints. He promised them systemic reforms, regular leave, better food, improved medical care, and, most critically, he promised them there would be no more suicidal offensives. He would wait for the new tools of war tanks, and the Americans. He restored the army's morale and its will to fight, saving France from total collapse. He ended the war in 1918 as a Marshal of France, the nation's savior. In the post-war euphoria of the 1920s and the turbulent 1930s, Philippe Pétain was no longer just a soldier. He was a living god, the human symbol of France's victory and its unimaginable suffering. His popularity and moral authority dwarfed that of any politician in the chaotic, unstable, and deeply divided Third Republic. He became the nation's father figure, the victor of Verdun, a name spoken with a reverence that bordered on worship. This immense popularity translated into immense political influence. He served as vice president of the Supreme War Council, the highest military body in the nation, and later as Inspector General of the Army. In 1934, during a period of intense political crisis, he was called to serve as Minister of War. In these roles, he was the single most dominant voice in shaping all of French military policy, guiding its strategy, procurement, and doctrine based on the one great, terrible victory that had defined his entire life. Herein lies the central tragedy of Pétain's military career. The hero of World War I, through his own doctrines, created the very weakness that would lose World War II. The lessons he had learned in the mud of Verdun kills. That defense is superior to offense, and that methodical, artillery-based battles are the key to victory were revolutionary in 1916. But by 1930, they had calcified into an inflexible, unchallengeable dogma. Pétain became the chief architect and most powerful proponent of the Maginot Line, a massive, continuous chain of state-of-the-art, concrete fortifications built along the French border with Germany. It was the ultimate expression of his philosophy. A static, impregnable shield designed to make a German frontal assault impossible and bleed the enemy dry, just as he had done at Verdun. It was a technological marvel, a monument to his past victories, and it would prove to be a strategic catastrophe. Pétain's defensive doctrine, hardened into the concrete and steel of the Maginot Line, was a perfect answer to the last war. It was a static shield in an age that was about to be defined by dynamic, high-speed movement. The line itself was brilliant, but it had two fatal flaws. First, it was blind to new tactics. While France invested its entire military budget in concrete, a new generation of theorists in Germany, like Heinz Guderian, were developing the concept of blitzkrieg lightning war, a revolutionary doctrine based on the concentrated, high-speed striking power of massed tanks supported by dive bombers and motorized infantry, designed to punch through a weak point and encircle the enemy, not engage in a static slugging match. Ironically, one of the loudest proponents of this new mechanized warfare in France was Pétain's own former protege, Charles de Gaulle, whose book Bears Ilme, the Métier, the Army of the Future, was dismissed by Pétain and the High Command. Second, the line was incomplete. It did not cover the border with Belgium through the impassable Ardennes forest, the very place the Germans would aim their armored spearhead. While Pétain's military thinking froze in time, his political ideology began a dark, dangerous evil. The hero of Verdun, the man who had saved the Third Republic, began to grow to despise the very system he had sworn to protect. He was a man of the 19th century, a devout Catholic, a social conservative, and a believer in order, hierarchy, and tradition. He looked at the Third Republic of the 1930s and was filled with a profound, bitter disgust. He saw what he considered to be decadence and moral rot, the revolving door of weak coalition governance, the bitter labor strikes and social unrest, the rise of socialism and the left-wing Popular Front government of Leon Blum. He saw a France that was weak, divided, and, in his mind, undeserving of the sacrifices soldiers had made. He yearned for a national revolution that would cleanse the nation of its democratic failures and restore traditional authoritarian values. This deep-seated disgust with democracy and modernity caused Pétain to gravitate towards the new authoritarian, ultra-conservative ideals that were sweeping Europe. He was not, in the conventional sense, a fascist. He did not share the revolutionary, pseudo-socialist zeal of Mussolini or the racial fanaticism of Hitler. His was a more traditional, reactionary, and clerical form of authoritarianism. He deeply admired the corporate state of Salazar in Portugal, and, most significantly, he became an outspoken admirer of Generalissimo Francisco Franco in Spain. When the Spanish Civil War erupted in 1936, Pétain made no secret of his support for Franco's nationalist crusade against the Spanish Republic, which he saw as a parallel to his own desired crusade against French republicanism. This ideological drift positioned him as the natural, silent figurehead for France's own growing far-right movements, all of which dreamed of overthrowing the decadent republic and installing a strong, father-like leader. May 1940. The phony war ended, and the German war machine uncoiled. The Blitzkrieg was launched. As Pétain had planned, the Germans did not attack the Maginot Line. As de Gaulle had warned, they went around it. German panzer divisions burst through the impassable Ardennes forest, shattering the weak French divisions holding the line, and raced for the English Channel. The French army, trained for a slow, methodical WWI-style battle, was psychologically and strategically broken by the sheer speed of the German advance. The nation was collapsing. The government fled Paris, which was declared an open city. A tide of millions of refugees clogged the roads. France was in a state of profound shock, paralysis, and despair. In this darkest of hours, the terrified nation and its collapsing government called for the only man they believed could save them, the one living symbol of French glory, their 84-year-old savior, Marshal Philippe. At the time of the invasion, Pétain was serving as the French ambassador to Franco's Spain, a post he had been given by Prime Minister Edouard, who astutely distrusted the Marshal's political ambitions and wanted him out of the country. But as the military situation became apocalyptic, the new Prime Minister, Paul Reynaud, desperately recalled Pétain from Madrid, appointing him vice-premier on May 18, 1940. Reynaud's hope was that the Marshal's heroic image would bolster national morale and strengthen the government's will to fight. He was catastrophically wrong. Pétain did not return to Paris to inspire resistance. He returned, in his own mind, to manage the inevitable defeat and, as he saw it, to save the French people from the folly of their politicians. He was seen by the panicked populace as the only man, the only symbol of authority and compassion, who could hold the nation together as it disintegrated. The French government, now relocated to Bordeaux, was bitterly and fundamentally split. A high-stakes debate raged, one that would decide the fate of France for the next half-century. One faction, led by Prime Minister Reynaud and a fiery, newly appointed junior general named Charles de Gaulle, argued for resistance. They proposed that the government flee to French North Africa, specifically Algiers. From there, protected by the powerful and intact French Navy, one of the largest in the world, and supported by the vast resources of the French colonial empire, they could continue the war against Germany alongside their ally, Great Britain. This was the path of continued struggle, of honor, of defiance. De Gaulle urged Reynaud to fight on, to keep the flame of French resistance alive, no matter the cost. The other faction, the defeatists, coalesced around the immense, immovable prestige of Philippe. The Old Marshal argued that the battle for France was over and the war was lost. He insisted that the idea of fleeing to North Africa was an act of cowardice and desertion. A government, he argued, must not abandon its people. It must stay and share the suffering of the nation. For Pétain, the military defeat was more than just a failure of arms. It was a moral judgment, a divine punishment for the sins and decadence of the Third Republic. He saw the defeat as a necessary, painful purification, a chance to cleanse the nation and rebuild it from the ashes. His argument, backed by his heroic aura and the exhaustion of the other ministers, won the debate. Reynaud, seeing he had lost control of his own cabinet, resigned as prime minister on the evening of June 16, 1940. President Albert Lebrun, seeing no other option, formally appointed the 84-year-old Pétain as the new Prime Minister of France. His one and only mandate was to seek an end to the fighting. The very next day, on June 17, 1940, Philippe Pétain, the victor of Verdun, went on French national radio and addressed his broken country. His voice was that of a solemn, heartbroken father. He did not yell or rally. I say to you, Today, A intoned, that fighting must stop. Il faut cesser le combat. He announced that he was seeking an armistice from the enemy, an armistice to be signed between soldiers after the fight and in honor. He concluded his speech with the words that would define his new regime. I give myself to France. La France le donne de ma personne. From millions of terrified French citizens huddled around their radios, exhausted from the fighting and the flight, his words were a profound, almost religious relief. The suffering was over. The old man, the hero of Verdun, would protect them, would act as a shield between them and the terrifying German army. He was still their savior. But for a very small few, his words were the sound of ultimate betrayal. In London, Charles de Gaulle, who had fled France just hours earlier, heard the speech. He saw it not as a sacrifice, but as a dishonorable surrender of France's body, its army, and its soul. While Pétain was surrendering France on June 17th, de Gaulle would go on BBC Radio on June 18th and make his own famous appeal, insisting that the flame of French resistance must not and will not be extinguished. The nation now had two leaders, one at home, offering submission, the other in exile, offering defiance. Hitler, in a move of calculated, supreme humiliation, demanded that the armistice be signed in the exact same railway carriage at Compiègne had been forced to surrender in 1918. The armistice, signed on June 22, 1940, divided France. The north, including Paris and the entire Atlantic coast, became the occupied zone under direct German military rule. The remaining southern 2/5 of the country became the free zone Libre, to be administered by Pétain's new government. This government established itself in the sleepy, faded spa town of Vichy. On July 10th, the Rump French Parlement National Assembly met in the Vichy casino. In a panic and under immense pressure, they voted overwhelmingly to grant Marshal Pétain full and absolute constitutional powers to write a new constitution. The vote was 569 to 80 in that moment. The French Third Republic legally voted itself out of existence. With this absolute power legally in his hands, Pétain did not hesitate. He immediately became the executioner of the republic he had once saved. He abolished the presidency and declared himself chef de l'État France, head of the French state. This was not a presidency, it was a personal dictatorship. He immediately launched his long-dreamed-of Revolution Nationale, or National Revolution. This was a conservative, authoritarian revolution designed to purge France of its democratic, liberal, and secular traditions. The iconic motto of the French Republic, Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité, Liberté, equality, fraternity, was immediately abolished. It was replaced with a new, reactionary trinity: travail, famille, patria, work, family, fatherland. The new Vichy state was built on a cult of personality around Pétain, and its policies were anti-Semitic, anti-democratic, xenophobic, and deeply traditionalist. When does the act of saving a nation become the act of betraying it? For many, the answer was visualized in a single, infamous photograph taken on October 24, 1940. At a meeting in the town of Montoire-sur-Loire, Philippe Pétain was photographed shaking hands with Adolf Hitler. For the Nazis, it was an unimaginable propaganda coup, the greatest living French hero, the victor of Verdun, willingly shaking the hand of his nation's conqueror, and pledging collaboration. Pétain believed he was still acting as France's shield, playing a double game where he would protect the French people from the worst of the occupation, while de Gaulle, the sword, fought abroad. But this handshake signaled to the world, and to his own people, that his shield would be an active and willing partner to the new masters of Europe. The Vichy regime's collaboration was not passive or forced. It was active, ideological, and willing. Believing that France would find a place of privilege in Hitler's new European order, Pétain's government sought to anticipate German demands. It established its own brutal internal security force, the Milice, which worked with the Gestapo to hunt down resistance fighters. The regime enacted its own anti-Jewish laws, the Statut des Juifs, in October 1940, before the Germans had even demanded them, barring Jews from public service, education, and media. The most shameful moment came in July 1942 with a rifle du Veldehive. Veldehive roundup, it was the French police under the authority of Petain's government who rounded up more than 1,300 Jews in Paris, including over 4,000 children, and herded them into a sports stadium, before handing them over to the Germans for deportation to Auschwitz. Furthermore, Vichy created des services du travail obligatoire, a forced labor draft that sent hundreds of thousands of young Frenchmen to Germany to work in factories, aiding the Nazi war effort. In August 1944, Astiales, including de Gaulle's Free French forces, liberated France. The Germans forcibly evacuated Pétain and his regime where they were forced to play out a grotesque charade as a government in exile. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, Pétain, refusing to flee, voluntarily returned to France to face his fate. His trial for high treason began in July 1945. It was a painful, divisive, and theatrical spectacle. The 89-year-old Marshal, the hero of Verdun, sat in the dock, mostly silent and seemingly senile. The nation was forced to confront its own past. The chief prosecutor, André Mornet, was the same man who, in 1917, had prosecuted the spy Henri. But the real trial was between two ghosts, the hero of Verdun and the dictator of Vichy. The nation, led by its provisional president, Charles de Gaulle, had to decide which man it was trying. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. On August 15, 1945, Philippe Pétain was found guilty of high treason and national indignity. He was sentenced to death by firing squad. But the final, complex act of the drama was yet to be written. The man who now held Pétain's life in his hands was Charles de Gaulle. The man Pétain's own Vichy regime had sentenced to death in absentia for treason in 1940. De Gaulle, in an act of political wisdom and perhaps complex personal mercy, immediately commuted the sentence to life imprisonment. He did so, citing Pétain's immense aids and, pointedly, the services he had once rendered to France at Verdun. De Gaulle, who had once idolized the Old Marshal, wrote that the tragedy of Pétain's life was not the treason of 1940, but the senility of an old man who had lived too long, his glory turning to dust. Philippe Pétain was stripped of all his titles, ranks, and honors, with one symbolic exception. The dignity of Marshal of France, as it was argued that a military rank once earned in battle could not be revoked by a court. He was imprisoned for life on the Isle d'Yeu, a bleak, windswept island fortress off the Atlantic coast, très alone and disgraced. On July 23, 1951, at the age of 95, he was a senile, broken man. His name already erased from public monuments and street signs across the country he had both saved and destroyed. His legacy remains a mirror of France, an open, a subject of profound, bitter, and unresolved debate, the ultimate cautionary tale of how the greatest of heroes can live long enough to see himself become the villain. His name, a byword for national glory, and then for national shame.